Shabbat Shalom. Last week, my daughter Shalva came back from kindergarten and she told us about what she learned about Thanksgiving at kindergarten, talked about the first Thanksgiving meal and the pilgrims whose food grew moldy on the Mayflower. Before I go any further, I wanted to acknowledge that, as we've been hearing ever more recently over the past few years, the Thanksgiving story as we know it was a false myth, and it was appropriative, as are many myths. And I fully understand and accept that obviously the encounter between the Europeans and the native population in this nation was devastating. And the first Thanksgiving meal was very different than what the school plays portray here and in all parts of our nation, or most parts of our nation. And yet, what Shalva was talking about was a small group of settlers. A few years after 100 pilgrims had crossed over on the Mayflower from Europe to seek out religious freedom in the New World, and they had the perilous crossing of the sea with the moldy food, and half of the pilgrims died because of harsh conditions during the very first winter. And here they were at a meal, a coming together with the local Native Americans, sharing a meal of squashes and pumpkins and deer, probably not corn or turkey or sweet potato or marshmallows. And it was not only a festive meal, as we're taught now, it was also a military alliance, an opportunist military alliance. And yeah, we can imagine that they were very grateful for that moment. And it would have been very difficult for them to understand that they were to become a small group of persecuted individuals, as they felt themselves to be, the symbols for the creation of a nation that would become the world's strongest and most powerful, and that their meal would be commemorated by 350 million people braving packed highways and crowded airports every year to reunite with family members and enjoy a good meal of Thanksgiving, eating new world foods and so on. And they were outcasts and they were imperfect, and most of the time they were just surviving and bickering, and their high religious aspirations were rarely met. But they became the symbols. And one never knows as we do what we do what the meaning of all of it is. And it may be that after being raised for hundreds of years as the founders, the stories of the pilgrims will be forgotten or cast aside in favor of other stories. And the universe does not always work the way we think it is. God has not always worked the way we think God would act. And this may be, in fact, one of the most important messages of the whole Torah. Torah is not predictable, and God is not predictable. You'd think Moses would be the beginning of a line of great descendants, but we know nothing about his descendants. While Korach, who was the one who challenged Moses and raised up a rebellion and ended up being swallowed by the earth, has a whole group of psalms named after him and his sons. What is the meaning of all of it? Who's going to be on top and what the outcome will be? Nothing is ever really simple and straightforward. The Torah is a wonderful thriller, a top bestseller. And it's thrilling and complicated and changing in our minds and hearts, as all of our lives. And maybe this is why the Torah has captured our hearts and souls for so very long. The family stories and feuds and jealousies and coming togethers and breaking apart again, and triumphs and mistakes and issues and even murders and massacres. And in today's Parsha, for instance, we have a very disturbing story, the story of Judah and Tamar. Judah is a leader and father of our people, and he ends up mistakenly sleeping with his daughter-in-law, who pretends to be a prostitute because he refuses to allow her to remarry and bear a child. Just a horrible story with very little redeeming to it. Except that out of this story of questionable morality and behavior comes a child, Peretz, and Peretz, the son of Tamar, and her father-in-law Judah, is numbered as the first descendant of King David and therefore of the Mashiach line, of the Messiah. That somehow through this challenging story and all its strange happening, Peretz, somebody with special qualities, is born. Qualities are passed down from generation to generation. We have so many ideas and conceptions and judgments and worries and hopes and anxieties, but our view of the complexity of life sometimes feels so minuscule. And the Torah tries to bring this to our attention again and again. The universe uses all sorts of situations and peoples one way, and then it changes again. And our human judgment can't always understand it. We do not see what the divine sees. And we never know quite what is happening and who will be God's instruments. And the Torah depicts God's judgment as coming down in the most unusual of ways and is revealed in the right moment when suddenly it's the right time in the divine plan. And the very formation of the line of Messiah is also unexpected and very strangely timed as the book of Samuel. And Saul is the first king of Israel, and he's anointed by the prophet Samuel. And we believe he's going to be the one who starts the line of kings and brings redemption to Israel. And he's taller than all the Israelites, and he's handsome, and he's charming, and he's also humble. He should be the one. And yet he fails. And everything he does is just to pave the way for a young shepherd boy, David, the youngest of all the brothers, a ruddy boy with perhaps too much self-confidence and too much ego, complicated in himself, makes many mistakes. And it's not just David that's complicated, but his lineage comes from out-of-the-box partnerships. His great-grandmother was from an enemy of Israel, Moab, a Moabite, Ruth, and his great-grandfather, his descendants were all the way down to Peretz, who we read about in our Parsha. And yet in that is the promise of redemption, the founder of Mashiach and the Messianic line, and one day a promised golden age of peace and harmony for all. And so we have this strong sense running through our Bible that don't think you understand what God is trying to do. And don't be fooled by how life appears to be. There's always more behind the surface, behind the great web of life. And we see the same perspective reflected in the great drama of our Parsha and the stories of Joseph over the next few weeks as well. Joseph's brothers throw him into a pit, sell him to slavery, and they carry this guilt and this shame for many decades, perhaps as they should. But finally, at the end of the whole journey, when Joseph's brothers understandably think they're responsible for what happened, for his suffering over all those years and their father's suffering, thinking their son was dead, Joseph, when he reveals himself to them, says, no, it was God working through you to bring us all down to Egypt and save our people in the ancient world. Who could have thought? Perhaps the lesson to all of us is that it's not always so simple in our own lives to understand what is happening. We have so many relationships that break down, but then they come back together again. And we see how many gifts we gain from even our failures. And we see how our mistakes lead to forgivenesses and renewal to clear away all the dross. And that these complexities are truly the very stuff of life. And perhaps the most important lesson of all of it is to have compassion for others and for ourselves, and not to rush to judgment, but to be ready to forgive. As our tradition's great teachers tell us, we need to look at ourselves first and to do our best with all the complexity in our lives to find the truth. And to know that in this strange world of ours, there are forces that we cannot imagine, and to navigate our lives with humility and faith, and always place love at the center of our journeys. And in the end, our tradition believes that life is ever evolving, and sometimes our perspectives do change, and we need to learn to see things differently. And we have to find the space to acknowledge the sufferings of others and put aside the myths that no longer work, and see the power of the true story that's underneath it all. And sometimes we embrace it nonetheless, and sometimes we do not. Master of the universe, Ribono Shel Olam, grant us wisdom and fortitude to see clearly and with compassion, and to understand our lives in your complex universe with more profundity and gratitude. Shabbat Shalom.